Hi, welcome to the video Spring Data JPA EntityManager CRUD examples. I am Nam Haming from Code.net. In this video, I'd like to help you briefly understand about Entity Manager. What is Entity Manager? When and why using Entity Manager in Spring Data JPA, and then I'll show you how to code a Spring Boot project that demonstrates the create, update, retrieve, and delete or CRUD operations using Entity Manager. So what is Entity Manager? The Entity Manager interface is an API that manages the lifecycle of entity instances, such as create and remove persistent entity instances, find entities by their primary key, query over entities, and an Entity Manager instance manages a set of entities that are defined by a persistence unit, and the Entity Manager checks all entity objects for changes and synchronizes the changes with database. You can use Entity Manager as a zero-purpose DAO interface without specific repository interface, and you can use Entity Manager in a repository layer, service layer, or controller layer of your application. Now, I'm going to code a new Java Spring Boot project to demonstrate using Entity Manager for performing CRUD operations. Create, retrieve, update, and delete on the MySQL database. As you can see, I'm using Spring Tool Suite IDE. You see, I'm using Spring Tool Suite 4 version 4.11.0. Okay, and now let me create a new Spring Starter project. New Spring Starter project. Okay, and name the project as Entity Manager examples, and I choose Java version 11. Okay, package name, group name, net.codejava, artifact version 1.0, and description, demo CRUD operations using Entity Manager, and the package name net.codejava. Okay, and click next and choose the Spring Boot version. I choose version 2.5.8 and choose the dependencies for Spring Data JPA and MySQL JDBC driver. Okay, and click Finish to create a project. You see, it is creating a Spring Boot project, and Maven is downloading the dependencies or the jar files of Spring Boot and MySQL JDBC driver and Spring Data JPA. So just a moment. Okay, you see the project got created completely here. It is a Maven project. You can see in the POM XML file. You see the version of Spring Boot starter parent here, Java version, and we use the dependencies for Spring Data JPA and MySQL connector Java, which is JDBC driver. In this project, I don't need to use test, so delete this test dependency. Okay. And you can see the jar files here, and then delete the test package here. Okay, and the first thing we need to configure in this project is update the application configuration file, the application.properties file, defines Spring data source, spring.data source URL. This is a JDBC URL to a database on MySQL server. So the URL is jdbc:/mysql: and // is localhost port number 3306, and then the database name. This is MySQL Workbench, and I create a new database schema which the name is contactdb. Apply to create a new database schema. You see the contactdb schema here. set as default schema, no tables. Okay, and then specifies the data source, username and password. Username, root, and password. And then we need to specify some additional properties for using Spring JPA with Hibernate framework. So we specify the property Spring.jpa .hibernate and ddl-auto equal update to our Hibernate framework. Generate the tables based on entity classes, and then we need to show SQL statement in the console. So we specify the property spring.jpa.show SQL equal true, and also I want to format the SQL statements in the console. So I use this property spring.jpa properties Hibernate format underscore SQL equal true. And then for using MySQL database, we should specify the database dialect class with this property .hibernate.dialect equal auth.hibernate.dialect.MySQL dialect. Okay. So this is configuration for data source and Hibernate and JPA properties. Next, let's code an entity class that maps to a table in the database. So let's create a new Java class. Contact. I want to code a new entity class named contact that maps to the context table in the database, and we use some annotations provided by JPA. The first annotation is entity, and the second annotation is the table annotation, and specifies the mapping table in the database, which is context. Okay, and then I declare the instance fields of this entity class. The first one is for the ID field. This field maps to the primary column in the table. So I use the ID annotation. And to have the values of this field generated automatically by the database, we need to use the generated value annotation, with the strategy is generation type identity. Okay, and the next field is name and email and address. Okay, and then generate getters and setters for the fields. Okay, select all and generate. Okay, so we have the entity class contact here. You see, you can see I don't use any annotations for the fields name, email, and the rest. So they will map with the columns with the same name in the database. Okay, and let's modify the main class EntityManager examples application here. You see it is a Spring Boot application here, and I want to code a command line application or a console application. So I have the main class implements this interface implements command line runner interface provided by Spring Framework, Spring Boot, and override the run method Okay, and for now I just print out something here. Hello. Okay, and now let me run this console application, and because I specify the property Spring.JPA.Hibernate.ddl auto equal update here, and we have a entity class here. So when I run the program, Hibernate will generate the table context according to the entity class here. Okay, now right click, run as Java or Spring Boot Up. And you see I got the error, no database selected. I need to update the application properties file here, specify the database contactdb, which is a schema name here, contactdb, and run again, run the program again. And you see it executed a CRUD table SQL statement for creating the contacts table with the columns ID, address, email, name. Okay, you see, let me check in MySQL Workbench, refresh all, and you see a new table got created here, the contacts table with the columns ID, address, email, and name. Exactly what we specify in the entity class here, contact. Okay, let me select rows, and you see the table is empty. And you can see in the console here, it prints the text hello here. That means the code in the run method got executed here. Next, let's code a repository class that uses EntityManager for performing CRUD operations. Okay, so create a new Java class, and I name the class as contact repository. And in this repository class, we'll use EntityManager to perform CRUD operations. Okay, so we can use the repository interface to indicate that this class is a repo. Okay, and then in this repository interface, we can use an entity manager like this. Declare a new field of type entity manager. You see the entity manager interface from the javax.persistence package here. Entity manager, and to let Spring framework Spring Boot inject an instance of entity manager, we need to use the auto while annotation. Auto while. Okay, and the first method we need to implement is for persisting a new contact object or saving a new contact object. So the method would be public void save contact, and we simply call entity manager dot persist. You can see the entity manager interface provides various methods for managing entity objects, you see, and for creating a new object, persisting a new object into the database, we use the method persist and passing the entity object instance. Yeah, okay, very simple. And then we update the main class to use the contact repository. Here we use auto while private contact repository repo. Okay, and the first method we want to test private void create contact, and we call repo save contact. We need to create a new contact object. Contact equal new contact, and set values for the fields of a contact set name, for example John Doe. Contact set email john.doe@gmail.com, and set address New York, USA, for example. Okay, and then we call the private method create contact in the run method here. Okay, now we are ready to run the program to test persisting a new contact object into the database with these details. Okay, you see the save method, you see EntityManager persist method here. Okay, let me run the program. Now run. Okay, you see we got an error. Okay, you see in the console you can see log line saying the local container EntityManager factory bin initialized JPA EntityManager factory for persistence unit default. The default persistent unit name is default, you see. And for this error is because we need to use transaction for the persist operation, for the create operation. So we need to use the annotation transaction annotation here for the save method from javax.transaction package. Okay, and run the program again. Okay, you see it executed the SQL insert statement, insert into context table, you see, and then it closes the EntityManager factory. Okay, and we can verify in the context table here. You see a new row was inserted with the values name John Doe, email johndoe@gmail.com, address New York, USA. Exactly the details I specify in the code here, you see. So that's the implementation of the first operation, create or persist entity object. Next, let's write code for implementing a retrieval operation, such as list or context from the database. So we implement the second method in the contact repository class here. Public list contact, and the method name is file. And to perform a retrieval operation, such as list, or we need to use a query. So we define a JPQL or Java persistent query language like this. Select C from contact C. Note that this is not a relation SQL statement. It is Java persistent query language. It looks like a relation SQL statement, but it is not. And then we need to create a new query object from the EntityManager. Create query. Create query here, passing the JPQL and passing the type. The result class type is contact.class, and it returns a type query of type contact query. Okay, and then we return query get result list. Very simple, right? For the retrieval operation that list all context from the database. Okay, and then in the main program here, we code another private method, private void list contacts, and simply call repo file. Okay, and we assign the return value to a list context, and we use for each statement to iterate to each contact object in the list collection and print out the details of each contact object system.out, and we use the method reference here. Okay, and then we need to call list context in the run method here. Comment the create contact call. Okay, and then we need to override the toString method in the contact class, so it will print the detail of the each contact object generate toString for all the fields generate. Okay, now we can run the program again to list all contacts in the database. You see, it executed a SQL select statement, select fields from the contacts table here, and you can see it prints the details of a contact ID 1, name John Doe, email here. Perfect, right? Let me run the create contact method again to proceed another contact. Ravi Kumar, Ravi.Kumar, and the rest Delhi, India. Okay, and run the program again. Also, I call list contacts after create contact. Okay. You see, it executed the SQL insert statement for positing a new contact object into the database, and then it executed the select SQL statement here, and you can see it prints two contact objects here, John Doe and Ravi Kumar. And let me check in the database in MySQL Workbench. You see we have two rows inserted into the contacts table here. Next, let's implement another retrieval operation that gets a contact by ID from the database. So we update the contact repository class here. Implement another method, public contact file by ID, integer ID. This method returns a contact object file with a given ID in the database. So here we simply return EntityManager. In the EntityManager interface, we can use the method file, and passing the class type is contact.class, and then the value of the primary key here. Very simple. And update the main program here. Implement another private method, private void get contact, and I want to get the contact with ID 2. So I call repo find by ID, and it returns the contact object. Okay, so I just print out the details of the contact ID 2. Okay, and I call get contact here in the run method. Okay, and then I'll run the program. You see, it executed a SQL select statement. You can see the where clause here, indicating that it selects a contact by ID here, and the details of the contact ID too printed here. Next, let's implement another method for updating an existing contact in the database. So we update the contact repository in the class public void update contact, and for update operation we should use the entity manager method is merge method here for updating an existing contact object. Okay, this merge method returns the updated contact object, so we can also return the updated contact object if needed. For example, the update method return the updated contact object like this. Okay, and then we update the main program here. Code a new private method, private void update contact. Okay, and I call update contact before list contacts here. Update contact, and I want to update the contact with ID 1 zone down here. So I want to get the contact with ID 1 using the repo method, repo file by ID, integer ID 1, passing ID. It returns the contact object. Okay, and then I want to update the email address, set email to zone.do.2020 at outlook.com. Change the email address, and then I call repo repo update contact, and it in turn it calls the merge method of the entity manager for updating an existing entity object. Okay, now let me run this program. I got an error because I forgot to use the transaction annotation for the update method. Transaction. Okay, and run the program again. Okay, you see, it executed the SQL update statement here. Update contact, set arrest, email name, where ID. Yeah, and then it select all the contacts from the database, and you can see contact ID, email updated to John Doe 2020 at outlook.com. Perfect. So that's the code example for the update operation using Entity Manager. And lastly, I'd like to show you how to code the delete operation in the contact repository interface, contact repository class here. So we also need to use the transaction annotation, public void delete a contact by ID. So firstly, we need to retrieve a contact object by ID. Entity Manager file contact dot class ID. It returns the contact object, and then to remove, we can use the remove method of the Entity Manager like this. Remove contact, and that's it, the code for deleting an entity object by ID. And then we update the code in the main program here. Private void delete contact. I want to delete the contact ID 1. So I call repo delete contact ID 1. Okay. So I call delete contact before calling list contacts. Delete contact. Okay, and run the program. You see, it executed the SQL delete statement. Delete from contacts table where ID here. And you can see for the list contact operation, it prints only the contact ID 2 here. Let me check the database. And you see the contact ID 1 was removed from the table. Note that in order to use an entity manager object in a repository or in a service or in a controller, besides the auto-while annotation here, you can also use the persistence context annotation that does the same thing. But you can also specify additional name type and persistent unit name if you wish to. So you can also use the persistent context annotation to tell Spring Data JPA create and inject an instance of entity manager object into the class. So let me run the program again. We test listing only contacts. Run the program again, and it should behave the same. You see, it lists only one contact in the contacts table, and you can see the class local container entity manager factory bin entity initialized JPA entity manager factory for persistent unit default. So you can use either auto-while or persistent contact to use an entity manager object in your class. Okay, so that you have learned how to use entity manager with Spring Data JPA to perform CRUD operations. I hope you found this video helpful. Please subscribe to my channel, like, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching.